Good night, Papua New Guinea. I'm Malcolm Barra, and welcome to another episode of Infocus. In this episode, we discuss the issue of countering trafficking in persons. Joining us for discussion, we have the International Organization for Migration Chief of PNG Mission, Mr. Serhan Aktoprak. Serhan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Firstly, Serhan, what is human trafficking, and can you give specific examples? It's an issue that a lot of Papua New Guineans are not familiar with.
I think this is a great opportunity to remind ourselves and the audience, of course. Trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, and the receipt of individuals for the purposes of exploiting them to gain benefits. And it can happen in various forms. The most common ones are sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, organ removal, and trafficking. We can count these among the most problematic ones, of course. Slavery-like conditions in which people are forced to perform actions against their will to leave the desperate conditions in which they are forced to perform can be counted as the most commonly seen forms of trafficking in persons.
Are there particular specific persons or individuals that will be most vulnerable to human trafficking?
Well, anybody is a potential victim of trafficking, including you and me. It doesn't matter if you're very well educated, if you're sophisticated, if you're intelligent or not, but those with less education and less awareness levels are more prone to be victims of trafficking in persons. And therefore we are constantly highlighting that education and awareness raising is key in preventing and hopefully eliminating this heinous crime from the surface of the world. But when we look at statistics, 71% of the victims are females and 29% are men. And of course you have a lot of children, elderly, and they are making use of these categories of individuals for different purposes. Elderly, you can see, can be basically forced to beg on the streets. The same applies to children as well, and particularly children and persons with good health. They can be exploited for the purposes of organ trafficking. But then there are other categories of individuals that we see are pretty vulnerable. These include the displaced people, internally displaced or displaced across the borders because of natural disasters triggered by natural hazards. Climate change, for example, is playing an important role, which is very actual for Papua New Guinea and the rest of the countries in this region that are forcing people to be uprooted from their homes. And when you're desperate, then you become to be vulnerable as you're trying to find a way out of your desperation. And these are the moments when people are preying on their victims. And there is a big intersection between gender-based violence and trafficking in persons. GBV is a very important issue in Papua New Guinea's agenda, and therefore I wanted to highlight this one as well.
Now, the organization you represent is the International Organization for Migration in the Papua New Guinean office. Can you give us a brief background of the organization and the work it does specifically in countering trafficking in humans or persons?
Thank you. Well, we are 72 years old. It was established in 1951. Our headquarters is in Geneva, and we have presence in more than 450 locations across the world. We currently count 74 countries as our member states, including Papua New Guinea, who joined IOM as a member state in 2012. However, our existence in Papua New Guinea dates back 22 years. IOM established its presence in the country in 2001. And we are one of the major contributors to the government's efforts, to countries' efforts in eradicating, combating trafficking in persons. We've been very much involved, and we support the government in developing laws, bylaws, when you open the standard operating procedures that is available on the Department of Justice's website, you will be able to see that it was developed in coordination and collaboration with IOM, in which we take pride. We are supporting the government in as and where required and necessary in conducting screening, so-called screening exercises to ascertain if suspected cases involve trafficking, to be able to identify as quickly as possible potential and actual victims of trafficking who can be subjected to various forms of exploitation, including sexual exploitation and labor exploitation, and then help with the referral of these individuals to care centers and necessary government agencies to follow up on the measures that need to be taken, including prosecution of perpetrators.
Thank you, Serhan. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back to Infocus. In this segment, we look at the government's interventions in countering trafficking in persons. Now, Serhan, you mentioned in the previous segment about your assistance to government. Can you give us a perspective on the extent to which you're coordinating with law enforcement agencies in countering the trafficking in people and persons?
Well, I'm very grateful to the government of Papua New Guinea for having invited IOM to participate in the Joint Action Group's meetings, which gives us an opportunity for us to share the information that we may be receiving with the relevant government agencies participating in this framework. And most importantly, of course, we have to remind ourselves and the audience that law enforcement is not something that IOM is engaged in, but we support because it is indispensable in countering this crime. And we provide capacity building support to law enforcement agencies as well as other government agencies, including judicial authorities and organizations that provide assistance in rehabilitation, reintegration, and referral of victims and potential victims of trafficking. More specifically, we support in the delivery of technical solutions to be able to prevent, detect, and respond to trafficking in persons, including through the delivery of equipment and other technical instrumental assistance that may be required. But in every intervention that we do, we make sure that the capacities are established to have a sustainable response system built and is continued.
Another area where which the government provides its interventions and its support in addressing countering human trafficking is in the implementation of its laws. What is your perspective on the existing anti-trafficking laws and legislations, and does it provide adequate attention to addressing human trafficking?
Well, let me start with the second point that you raised, whether if it provides adequate attention. I believe in the fact, it's not my word, of course, it's the word and statement of some very wise people that walk around the world. I believe in the fact that the biggest room in life is room for improvement. So whatever we may be doing, we need to build on top of it. And this basically captures the area of legal framework as well. When we look at the Papua New Guinean legal framework, we see that in 2013, 2014, with the amendment that was introduced to the Criminal Code of Papua New Guinea, a new provision was inserted, 208B, if I'm not mistaken, and this provides the comprehensive definition of what the trafficking is. When you look at it, it's pretty much in line with the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crimes so-called TIP, Trafficking in Persons Protocol, which was adopted in 2000. However, what we see could be considered, and this is one area in which we are supporting the government, is for Papua New Guinean government to consider acceding to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its TIP protocol. Why would that be necessary? A question may be asked. Well, first of all, let's remember that conventions are universal documents which help establish a universal framework in which the sovereign countries can be further given with opportunities to cooperate with each other, including in combating criminal activities. And bearing in mind that trafficking in persons is a phenomenon that is not possible to be tackled by any government or any entity alone, the UN's relevant convention will first of all give an opportunity for enhanced cooperation vis-à-vis the transnational nature of the trafficking in persons. The second one, it helps governments to approximate, to align their legislation under an umbrella framework. What will it mean? It will help improve the uniformity of the terminology that will enable the authorities, governments, to further standardize their approaches and the way that they tackle the problem. And of course, there is also a very strong political statement that the governments make. They commit themselves to work together to counter this problem. And I think it only brings a lot of advantages. And currently we are undertaking a review of Papua New Guinea's legislation by our experts in comparison with the UN's relevant convention and the TIP protocol, as well as other international instruments. And it will be presented as a set of recommendations to the government of Papua New Guinea for consideration for adoption. And I think certain advancements can further be made in the national legislation. And there is always a call for it because, look, dear Malcolm, we have to take into account that when we are combating crime, it can be any crime, but particularly in the area of trafficking in persons too, we have to admit the fact that traffickers are always one step ahead of us. And we are always trying to catch up with them because they constantly come up with new ways, methods, so on and so forth, to operate and continue their modus operandi. And this means that we need to continuously evolve. And therefore, I think the national legislation can benefit a lot from a review exercise, and our collective work can, I think, produce some very positive outcomes.
There have been many areas of the existing legislations and laws that a lot of the sections of the society have called for improvement. A particular example would be a statement which was made by the Caritas National Director, Mr. Mavis Tito, who stated in the Radio New Zealand website that it is important that those who created the demand also face the law. Many times, a lot of the focus is placed on the traffickers themselves, but rarely do you see the consumers being held accountable or held to their actions. Do you believe that is a fair, valid point?
Well, I think what we see in several countries, they basically have introduced measures against consumers. In Sweden, I know, for example, receiving services from a prostitute can be punishable. I don't know if other countries might be interested in adopting similar measures. But overall, when we look at the definition of trafficking in persons, it can be giving us enough ground and infrastructure to build on. I think, first of all, we have to be cognizant of the fact that this calls for a whole of society approach. And this also includes consumers as well. I want to give you an example. Every day we buy products. We are consumers, right? Are we looking at the very essence of the fact whether if the items we buy, they were manufactured whereby respecting to the labor work of the people who actually worked in those factories, in those sweatshops? Are we asking the question to ourselves if any exploitation might have happened during the production and supply chain of any service or any product that we are paying for? I think, therefore, a lot of responsibility falls on consumers as well. IOM has a number of initiatives, and one of them is very much geared to support countries, private sector particularly, recruitment agencies, in establishing a recruitment system based on respect to integrity. And the system is so-called IRIS, and it's been recognized as our member states in our council meetings as a best practice, in which IOM supports countries, the private sector, in establishing mechanisms that will help them apply a standardized approach from recruitment to the return of the workers, when we are talking about migrant workers, for example, who are very much involved in the production cycles of goods and consumables, and as well as the manufacturing of and extraction of raw materials that are basically very much relied on. So IOM would be continuing to remain as a committed partner of the international community, as well as the private sector and the governments. And we would encourage everybody to reach out to us if they would like to learn more and explore ways of cooperation. But again, this is something that rests on the shoulders of each and every one of us, to look beneath the surface, what is happening there, and question.
Thank you, Serhan. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back. You're watching In Focus. Now, Serhan, what role do you see for non-government organizations and multilateral institutions in countering the trafficking of persons and humans in Papua New Guinea and the region as a whole?
Thank you very much. It's a very valid and very important question, of course, like the rest that you have asked. Well, let's not forget that non-governmental organizations, including faith-based organizations, community-based organizations, they play a crucial role in everyday life. And this includes need to effectively combat trafficking in persons problem. First of all, they can help in raising awareness within their own selves, and then across the board throughout the country, because they are very much working very closely with communities and schools, and carrying the message forward, sensitizing people about the dangers of trafficking, risks of irregular migration, including irregular border crossings. These may seem separate, but they are very close, and the person who is an irregular migrant is naturally more prone to become a victim of trafficking. And in the blink of an eye, this could basically happen unintentionally and unforeseen, and we know and we see the examples. So the best way of solving a problem is actually to prevent it in the first place. And civil society organizations and international organizations, they have a big role to play. That's number one. Number two, referral of victims and potential victims of trafficking to to relevant government agencies and service providers so that they undertake their responsibilities vis-a-vis prosecution, for example, when we talk about the perpetrators, identification of victims, and their referral to rehabilitation, reintegration, or integration, where it may be necessary. And then capacity building of government agencies and other stakeholders, including within their own communities. I would like to remind again to what I have mentioned a little bit earlier. This is such a complex problem. It requires everyone's cooperation without exception. And there is a very well-known 4P approach, the so-called 4P approach to combating trafficking in persons. It's prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnerships. And partnerships basically is an umbrella in which we all need to be working together.
Finally, the World Day Against Trafficking in Humans is held every year on the 30th of July. Why is it important to commemorate such a day, and what sort of activities do you have planned for this year?
It is not a day to celebrate trafficking in persons. It's not something to be celebrated, but it is to remind us that such a problem exists. And modern slavery, unfortunately, is there. It is the second biggest revenue-generating crime after drug trafficking. 10 years ago, we used to say it was the third after drug trafficking and arms trafficking. Now it's gone one step up, generating an estimated revenue of about $150 billion a year, which is massive. There are an estimated 27.6 million victims of trafficking around the globe. A big, significant portion of them are children. So we have to remind ourselves, and at least once a year, we basically use this opportunity to raise awareness and call for joint action. And IOM annually, throughout the world, through its country offices and with our partners, we carry out at least some sensitization activities, and this year as well we are planning something modest. But next year we are planning a series of activities that will be covering the entire country, because we want to reach out to even those places that are considered to be not easily accessible in Papua New Guinea. But on this occasion, please allow me to convey IOM's desire to work with EMTV in undertaking awareness-raising activities on the occasion of the 30th of July. And this is actually a very good opportunity for us to cooperate. And therefore, I want to thank you again for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Serhan. We'll have to leave it here. Before we go, I'd like to take this time to thank our special guest, Mr. Serhan Aktoprak, Chief of Mission for IOM PNG. Serhan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
That's all the time we have for this edition of Infocus. Thank you for joining us, and until next week's edition, good night from us.